Welcome to The Trace, my friends. I'm Andrew Thomas Hackett. I'm so happy to have you here, listening to thoughts and topics that maybe you don't always hear, at least I hope. Something fresh, and always, I hope, something like encouraging, something inspiring. Again, that's the hope. We're in a time of pandemic. We're in times of pretty extreme change. I hope, fingers crossed, with Black Lives Matter and a real pursuit of the kind of justice that we've never seen in America. And I'm with everybody. I'm trying to get out there at least once a week in the streets with people supporting Black Lives Matter and defunding the police and creating a different kind of world. Because you know what? There's more possibilities than we usually allow ourselves to imagine as to how we live. Today I wanted to talk to you about something that would maybe seem irrelevant to this, but I don't believe it is irrelevant. And I wanted to make an ethical argument for the value of horror movies. In other words, why watch horror movies? I frequently meet people that say they can't watch horror movies. And hey, if you really feel like it's too scary, you can't handle it, that's fine. Maybe you still want to think about it and listen to this little conversation, little talk. Maybe you've seen a few horror movies and you're a little bit curious about exploring some more. I wanted to really make basically like a theological, a philosophical, a moral argument for why horror movies are important and even why they are good. Ha! During quarantine, this has been very strange for me, as I'm sure it's been for you. We're coming up on 4 months soon of this. It's, one of the weirdest periods of my life, again, as I'm sure it is for you. Very fortunate that I'm healthy. And I hope that you are as well, and I hope you're doing okay economically. And, it's crazy. I mean, what can I say? None of us have ever experienced anything like this before. So this has been crazy, and I've been using quarantine. It's actually been quite rewarding, generally. Believe me, I've had my struggles, again, like I'm sure that you have. But it's given me a chance to read, to write. I've written, I think, 3 or 4 short stories, continuing working on my novel. During this, I've gotten to interview all kinds of beautiful people. I even started 2 other podcasts that I'll tell you about at some point. So it's been very rewarding. And it's also been a chance for me to watch a ton of movies. I am a film lover since as far back as I can remember. I literally recall being a kid, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years old, sitting on my grandparents on the living room floor watching TV and seeing these 2 mysterious men, Siskel and Ebert, as they spoke intellectually about movies. And again, I loved movies so much, as far back as I can remember, but I had never heard people talk like this anywhere, really. I hadn't heard anything like this, because basically they're, intellectuals. But not only were they smart, they were very much concerned with morality. Now, a lot of the movies that I'm going to talk about here that I love, they a lot of times argued against. They viewed them as immoral. I totally disagree. I'll say why later. But still, Siskel and Ebert helped me. Basically, I thought, I want to meet people like that. And I want to have friends like that. And I want to talk with people like that. And I've been searching my whole life, the rest of the way through, to meet people that are both intelligent and kind, that's the master combination right there, I think. Intelligence and kindness together. Intelligence without kindness is not enough. Not enough. We need love, and we need, ethics, morality. So that's Siskel and Ebert, and it started to make me think that there was more to movies than, Police Academy or whatever. And so my parents were cool, like let me watch lots of movies, and my dad took me to the movies all the time, usually comedy movies or action or drama. But horror was the one that, was kind of like, no horror movies. And that was very normal in the 80s when there was this big scare about horror movies and heavy metal and the satanic panic. And if you listen to the wrong music or see the wrong film, you're going to become, a killer or demon-possessed or something. I have very strong opinions about this that, again, I'm going to come back to later. But because of this, I had a pretty good film knowledge by the time I was into my 20s. Pretty general film knowledge, including foreign and classic cinema, art cinema, But I was too scared to watch so many movies. I hadn't seen Jaws, I hadn't seen The Exorcist, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Hellraiser, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, all these, famous movies I hadn't seen. And I thought both I was scared to watch them. I also think that I just assumed that they would not be artistic or that they would be immoral because that's kind of what I was told growing up. And not just growing up as an evangelical, hippie Christian kid, but even in the mainstream society, like when I'd listen to Siskel and Ebert talk. And there's this idea that horror movies were less than, dramas or something. Well, during quarantine, in my 30s, I was able to finally see Exorcist and Nightmare on Elm Street and a lot of these movies. And I found myself really liking a lot of these movies. And some of these movies ended up being my very favorite movies of all. And it's just somehow in the recent year or two, I've become more and more interested in horror. And during quarantine, this has gone into full on obsession. So I have a huge list of horror movies that I've been trying to watch, and I've been going through them. And I'm probably watching 10 movies a week or something, hopefully. And the vast majority of those have been horror. And I just cannot get enough. And again, I'm not watching just anything. And I'm not really interested, for example, I'm not talking about torture porn. So get that out of there. That's its own thing. I'm talking about, fear and exploring darkness. And my entrance to that was seeing The Shining when I was probably 15. And I was like, I've never seen anything like this before. And also it was probably the best movie I'd ever seen up to that point. And then later on, the work of David Lynch. That's what really, who, isn't classic genre horror, but he has the scariest movies. And when I say horror, I just mean movies that scare you, okay? It's not a technical genre term. I don't even really believe in those kind of technical definitions of genre. So during quarantine, I've just found myself drawn towards horror. And so I've been watching as much as I can, and it's been extremely rewarding. And I also want it to seep into me for my own writing, really, even though I'm not writing traditional horror, but I'm very interested in exploring fear. And in fact, the reason why I'm writing fiction at all is because I was seeing a therapist and realized that I needed to explore myself more, especially including my shadow, more shadow later. So during this quarantine, a lot of my mental health has been through watching horror movies. It sounds funny, I know. As a child of the 80s, rom-coms, comedies, and action films, dominated. I guess especially comedy and action. And, it was fun to see Die Hard, or it was fun to see Airplane, Stripes, Ghostbusters. And those movies are fun. And they have their merit, At the same time, I realized, even when I was young, that if you watch Caddyshack or Animal House, you'll notice a radical misogyny, incredible misogyny, incredible objectification of women, in a way that makes those movies, frankly, for me, very difficult to even watch, because they're just, it's depressing to see women mistreated on film like that. And then action films, which were kind of considered harmless, I guess, a little bit. Actually, action films are the movies that tend to be most politically conservative. I think a lot of our ideas about police being heroes is because of all these action movies we've watched, which make it seem like everyone in the world is like a psycho killer, and if only the police could be free to just kill everybody, then we'd be safe. That is fucking bullshit, by the way. Just look up statistics about people in prison and how many of them are in prison for violent crime. And it's insane. Or how many times that the police are called, how often is it because of a violent situation? And it's like hardly any. It's like this minuscule percentage. I really believe that action movies in the 80s went hand in hand with Reagan and this tough on crime, which was really about white supremacy and mass incarceration of people of color. So I think that action movies just basically, Ronald Reagan and action films, it's like the same thing, the GOP and action. It's all supporting blue lives and white lives and trying to demonize people of color, and poor people. So I actually think if when you go back, the movies that were really harmful as far as ideology in the 80s were comedies and action movies. There's exceptions, of course, but they tend to glorify white men and the police. So I've really come to believe that rom-coms, comedies, and action movies generally tend to be more conservative, more conformity based, whereas horror movies tend to be subversive. They tend to challenge the norms, challenge conformity, challenge conservatism. Also, people tend to think of drama and horror as like completely separate or almost like they're opposites, where I actually think that drama and horror are actually almost the same thing. And you'll notice a lot of times when you're gonna want to, if you want to watch some movie with some people, and they're like, "Oh, let's watch an action movie," or let's watch a comedy or a rom com, and people tend to be more scared of drama because drama, what it deals with really difficult, painful things. It deals with suffering, deals with darkness. Hello, it's the same as horror. For example, my number one movie, my favorite movie of all time, Taxi Driver. Now that I guess you'd call a drama. You could just as well call it a horror movie. And that movie is unbelievably radical in its empathy and therefore politically liberal, politically progressive, as we see the conditions that lead to violence because of society and a person not having any place to be, a person being totally isolated and alone. If you think of recent films like First Reformed with Ethan Hawke, I think one of the best movies of the last decade, you could call that a drama movie, a religious film, or a horror movie. And all of those things would be true. Because again, you're dealing with, in that case, the terror of climate change and knowing that we have caused it ourselves, not God. God didn't cause it. We've done it. It's our actions. And what's scarier than facing responsibility? Nobody wants to do that. I recently watched Spike Lee's 2002 film 25th Hour with Edward Norton. If you haven't seen it, wow. One of the best American films of the last 20 years. Wrecked me. I wept. Same thing. You could just as much call that a drama as you could call it a horror film, because dealing with the realities of someone facing 7 years in prison, in a very dangerous prison, and then you have to think about what people all over this country are experiencing who are in jail right now, sometimes for ridiculous things like marijuana possession or even selling marijuana, or people that are obviously unjustly in prison. And even people that, did some like armed robbery but didn't actually hurt anyone of a 7-Eleven and they're in jail for like 20 years. Like people being put in solitary confinement, all these things. These are real. I also watched Cool Hand Luke for the first time with Paul Newman. You could call that movie a drama. You could call it even like a drama with some comedy. I felt horror the entire time as I thought of all the people in American history who have faced American prisons where we make people do slave labor, where we make people totally isolated, where we literally torture people in solitary confinement. What's more horrific than that? So I'm making a case that drama and horror are actually very similar. Now, if you look at the Oscars or the critics, drama movies are always the ones that, almost always that win the Oscar. They're almost always the ones that are considered the most prestigious. And I would argue that drama and horror are just coming at the same thing, but from different angles. Drama movies tend to be very naturalistic, whereas horror movies tend to give a physical reality to the fears and the sufferings that we face. So, why is it that people say that horror movies are bad? The first thing people usually say is that horror movies are misogynistic. Now, horror movies, of course, there are some movies that are misogynistic, and I haven't seen some of them that really deal with sexual violence, like Last House on the Left, or I Spit on Your Grave, or things like that. So I can't really say anything about those movies. And of course, there are horror movies that are misogynistic. But if you look at the best of the best in the genre, you're going to see strong, independent women that fight like hell against an evil man. Halloween being the greatest example of this, I think, with Jamie Lee Curtis, where she's an awesome, lovely, cool, strong, tough person who is courageous in protecting these children from this specter, the shape. You know, later on, Michael Myers, we called him. If you think about Alien, Sigourney Weaver, she is maybe like the greatest action hero of movies, period. Hey, she's a woman in a horror movie. If you think about Mulholland Drive, the Naomi Watts role, it's like one of the greatest performances I've ever seen. Incredible role. Think about Twin Peaks and everything that Cheryl Lee got to do, especially in Fire Walk with Me. You think about Mia Farrow and Rosemary's Baby. I know the director, obviously Polanski did a really bad thing. Doesn't take away from the fact that Mia Farrow gave an all-time performance. And hey, how about Janet Leigh in Psycho? Unbelievable. All these women get these great roles. And if you want to go through, especially in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, look at how many really great roles are there for women in comedies and action films. Lately, because of Judd Apatow, there's been more, better roles for women, and those things are in comedy. That's changed, but not in the 80s. Forget about it. I mean, basically every comedy, except I guess movies that Goldie Hawn was in. And then all in the 90s, it's like Clueless is like where you get really excellent role for Alicia Silverstone. In general, comedies and are you kidding me? Action movies, they're basically always male leads. So what's the genre that gives women like really great roles? It's horror. Interesting. Also, because there is violence in horror movies, this in no way is an argument that violence is good. And the best horror movies are movies about, they're stories about people, generally women, who fight against evil, who fight against injustice. They aren't passive movies. And there's no superhero. Like action films, if you think about Sylvester Stallone in Cobra or whatever, a bunch of those movies, or Arnold Schwarzenegger in the 80s, they're basically invincible. And how does that help? They're basically superhero movies, which I believe that superhero movies by definition are authoritarian, anti-democratic. Because in a superhero movie, a regular person can't do anything. There's no use in fighting back if you're a regular person. Or in other words, hey, your voice doesn't matter. You have no power. So you have to cede your power to Superman or to the Avengers or to the X-Men or whatever to save the day, to solve the problem, because we can't do it. I do think that in some way the Avengers movies have led to Donald Trump becoming president, because it's this idea that he directly spoke to, which is, I'm the only one who can do it. Nobody else can do it. And what would Barack Obama say every time that protesters were yelling or people were talking about injustice? He'd always say, I'm with you. But if we just yell about it, it's not going to do anything. Like, we've got to vote. You got to organize. So there you have promotion of democracy, whereas with Trump, you have superhero authoritarianism. And in fact, now we see where there's this attempt to suppress the vote explicitly by Trump and the GOP. Again, you have this authoritarianism, which to me lines right up with comic book movies. So in action films and superhero films, you need a superhero, someone who's not human, basically, really, to save the day. Whereas in horror movies, you have real people who are limited, who are vulnerable, who fight. That, to me, is beautiful and one of my very favorite things about horror films. There's also this thing that people always say, which is, especially in slasher movies, which is a particular form of horror, that horror movies are about people being punished for having sex. This is the thing people always say. Now, that, of course, may be true in some cases. In the vast majority of these movies that I've been watching, that's not the case. In fact, I would argue the opposite. For example, I've been watching the Friday the 13th movies. I've seen parts 1, 2, 4, 6, and 7, like in the last 2 weeks. Okay. The Friday the 13th movies aren't particularly great. I do enjoy them. They're not very ideological. Jason doesn't even seem to have a motive. It's like, what does he even do? He's not a zombie. He's not a vampire. He's not really, he's not eating people. He's not a cannibal. He just kills. And then he kills the next person. And that's it. Which is kind of, I guess, interesting in its lack of content. This is similar, I get, to Mike Myers in Halloween, where motive is not really clear, and that's scary in its own way, which is when people do things for no reason at all. especially cause pain. So in these movies, it's true that in the Friday 13th movies, teenagers, I guess they're usually like 18. They're usually supposed to be like just out of high school, maybe freshmen in college. I don't know. It's hard to say exactly how old they're supposed to be, but they're always the camp counselors. So they're whatever, seniors in high school, freshmen, sophomores in college, something like that. They go to Camp Crystal Lake, and they go there and they're excited. They're excited to be with their friends. They're excited to have sex. Yes. And what you see in these movies also specifically is young women that are excited to have sex. In these movies, it's not like watching erotic thrillers in the 90s where it's always like, oh, it's so crazy and bad and it's so devious to have sex. No, that's not what they're like at all. In these movies, it's teenagers that are excited to have sex, and they're having sex, and then usually right after they have sex, sometimes even during, Jason will kill them. There's also scenes where a person will be like skinny dipping in the lake at night, and then, in their vulnerability of being naked, which, hey, if you're 18 years old and you want to go skinny dipping in a lake where no one's around, shouldn't you feel like safe doing that? And like, shouldn't that feel like a celebratory, like beautiful thing to do? There's nothing bad about that. What I'm seeing is basically, if you look at Jason in the Friday the 13th movies, you have this boy who's been like abused and had this whatever. He's like traumatized and he's all messed up, including physically. He wears a mask and everything. Early in the second movie, he wears actually a hood. But you have basically an incel. You have a man who was not able to experience the joy of intimacy and sexuality like these young people are. And so what does he got to do? He's got to kill them. It's literally like Jason is the original incel. So what you really have is Jason's conservative. The kids are just living in freedom and curiosity, and they're doing nothing wrong. In fact, they're just enjoying life. Jason doesn't have the ability to enjoy, so he has to cause others to suffer when they enjoy. So it was surprising to me to watch these Friday the 13th movies and feel more like these movies actually aren't conservative. They're actually subverting the conservatism of puritanical America in the 1980s, which was absolutely against sexual exploration of any kind, and only for sex between a man and a woman and buying a house and having children. So I'm not saying that there aren't parts in horror movies where people are punished for sex, but what I've been seeing as I've been going through, and I'm mostly watching horror movies from the 70s and 80s, which is like peak horror. Once CGI and then digital photography come in, I think that horror is like drastically wounded and is very difficult to make a good horror movie on digital. And CGI absolutely ruins horror completely and totally for me. I don't want to watch a horror movie that has CGI in it. The practical effects when you watch The Thing or From Beyond, the 1980s remake of The Blob, that's where you see like, that's the glory of horror. As soon as you use basically video game graphics, it's just like turns into a cartoon. Horror and cartoon, in my opinion, it's not good. So in these 70s and 80s horror movies, I am not seeing people being punished for sexuality. I'm seeing a conservative male causing violence on men and women that are enjoying sex. In other words, the movies are critiquing puritanical sexuality. And I would say that it's a puritanical mindset that leads to thinking that like nudity or sex in a movie is automatically bad. Like, why? Why would you think that? I don't understand that. I personally love sex and nudity in movies, as long, obviously, as it's done, respectfully, and the actors are consenting and everything. So I think that this thought that because there's sex and nudity in horror movies, that means that they're misogynistic, to me, just like doesn't follow at all. I would actually argue the opposite. So why are horror movies bad? Are they bad because they're violent? Are they bad because they show evil? Are they bad because they confront suffering? I would argue again, the opposite. Let me backtrack a little bit. How do you deal with the reality of the darkness within you and out in the world? For me, again, I grew up in a kind of a hippie, commune, evangelical Christianity thing that was very nice. And I grew up around very sweet and loving people from all different places all over the world and different languages, colors, everything. And that was great. I was taught how to love. I was taught how to be kind. I was taught how to listen to others. I was taught how to listen to other people from other cultures and backgrounds, and that it's not just America, but it's a big world and God loves everybody. There's that scripture that I heard all the time, that every tribe and every tongue. That's what the kingdom of heaven is about, like all cultures represented. So it was mostly, really nice way to grow up. There's one major, massive problem here. There's a denial of darkness. Now, in that world, you tend to identify darkness as something outside of you. Darkness is like Satan or demonic or whatever, and then you as an individual are tempted by the darkness. As opposed to myself, you, everyone who's here, there's already a darkness present. It's a part of what it means to be a human being. Not only is there a darkness present in me, there is a darkness present in the world, which is the results of injustice, oppression, cruelty, greed, sexual violence, domestic violence, racism, homophobia, misogyny. If you don't allow yourself to identify with darkness, then you are, first of all, you're in denial. And second of all, you are beginning a unhealthy repetition of repression. I never had a way to deal with darkness at all, except to separate myself from it. It wasn't until for me, for like music, when I was like, 12, 13 years old, hearing Pearl Jam and Nirvana and Hendrix and all this music, that I was able to oh yes, there's that suffering, there's that darkness that I've always had, but I've never been able to articulate it or connect with it in a healthy way. When I started watching the films of David Lynch, I was terrified, basically. When I saw Mulholland Drive, when I saw Blue Velvet, I couldn't even watch Lost Highway until, it took me 5 tries to even get through it because it was so scary to me. But I also found something unbelievably cathartic. I found an identification, even in some way, with Dennis Hopper and Blue Velvet. It wasn't just that the evil is outside of me. Somewhere, that's in me too. And if I just deny that, then I'm going to repress. And if I repress, we all know what happens. When you repress, it's going to come out some way. And what it means is it's going to come out in a way that is unintentional, something you're not consenting to, something you're not even intending. And this is why you see this thing of religious leaders who you're surprised that a religious leader was a sexual molester of children, or was stealing money, or was doing domestic violence, or was doing something that they said they didn't believe in. It's because they're repressing and denying, and there's no way to deal in a healthy way with these, whatever you want to call them, negative, quote, emotions, or even ones that aren't negative, like sexual desire, right? But if you don't have a way to healthily and express sexual desire, well, what's going to happen? It's going to come out in some way that's sick, a sickness, and some way that in a sense you may not even intend. This is the scariest kind of action, in my opinion. Even when I was a minister in my 20s in an evangelical church in Mexico, I always had music, like punk rock, hip hop, metal, to help me stay in touch with the aggression inside of me and the anger and even and the pain and sadness, all that stuff. And it was important to me to stay connected to that, not to get rid of it. And movies were another way of going in. If you've ever watched any of the Ingmar Bergman movies, you're going in to pain intentionally. Why would you do that? Because we need to. We human beings, we need to experience stories that deal honestly with pain and darkness and suffering and evil. And if you don't do this in some kind of a way that works for you, it's like you're developing a sickness of the mind and the heart. You're in denial of yourself and who you are. And again, you all, of course, you have love, joy, kindness, empathy, compassion, mercy. You have all these good things too, of course. And that's the way to live publicly, right? Like when you're interacting with other people, that's not the time really to explore the darkness, right? Unless you're talking one-on-one with a therapist or a minister or a friend, honestly about whatever you're suffering through. Basically, when you're in public, that's the for the time of action of love, kindness, and empathy, and confronting injustice explicitly. That's why we're protesting right now. That's why we're out in the streets. It's time to change things. But where is the place where you can explore your, quote, negative emotions in a way that's safe? I believe that this is like maybe the primary purpose of art. Art gives us a healthy way to experience all of the self, all of the things that go on in the world. I've heard David Lynch talk about, he's a transcendental meditator. He meditates twice a day, 20 minutes a day, 20 minutes each time. And he's been doing this for like 35 years or something. He's never missed a meditation. And he always talks about peace and harmony and all this. And he says that people ask him, if you're so into peace and harmony and meditation, then why are your movies so dark and scary? And he says, well, because that's what stories are. That's what they're for. Stories are the place where you explore both the darkness, the pain, the anger, the rage, the cruelty, and also the love, the glory, the harmony, the peace. You need all of that stuff to make up a story. A story that would be all peace with no darkness or suffering, that's not a story. There's no story there, right? Another thing that horror movies do that is profoundly powerful, and dramas do this as well, is they give you the possibility of catharsis. An example of this for me is I experienced divorce, and along with divorce, a bunch of other things at the same time that were all very difficult. And I'm very glad to say that my ex and I are very good friends and very close, and that's a beautiful thing. But after experiencing divorce, I wanted to watch some movies about divorce. And some of the notable ones were Blue Valentine, A Serious Man, Husbands and Wives. All those movies were very helpful in some kind of way for me, very cathartic. But there was one movie that was a total healing experience for me. And if you've seen this movie, which most of you haven't, it's not a common movie, not a popular film exactly. It's a movie called Possession. It's from 1981. It's a movie about a couple that's going through a separation, and they have a child. And the child, a lot of the times, is almost kind of not even properly taken care of. But it's done on this level like Revolutionary Road or something, where it's way overboard. Like, it's on 10. It's on 11, the drama. They're throwing chairs. They're screaming at each other. They're pulling out butcher knives on each other. And it could seem ridiculous, and I'm sure to some people it is ridiculous. But for me, I found it to be like this absolutely unhindered expression of pain that, I never did that. I never threw a chair. I never, I wasn't screaming and wailing and all this kind of stuff. But I felt that way. I just didn't do that because I wanted to be loving and like not, scary or threatening or whatever. And so I always, wanted to be as forgiving, loving, understanding as I could be, even when going through a separation, a painful separation like that. And then when I watched the movie, it was like, gave me the chance to experience that without ever having to do it. This is the beautiful thing about what a horror movie and a drama can do. And the movie, I'll just tell you, gets even way crazier than it turns into like this almost Lovecraft, like super bizarro thing. And that's when the movie becomes a horror movie. And all of that aspect as well, I utterly and totally related to. It also has one of my favorite performances in any film by an actor, and her name is Isabella Adjani. And she has a scene that you can even look it up on YouTube, where she basically like experiences some kind of exorcism or miscarriage or something in kind of a empty subway area or something. It is astounding. It's so beautiful, and I resonated with it completely. And I also know it's a scene that a lot of people just can't even watch. It is unbelievable. So I thank Isabella Adjani. I know it was an exhausting experience for her, to do the movie. I've read her talk about it. I'm so thankful that she did it, even if that was the one and only movie she was going to make like that, because gave us something very special to people who have gone through that kind of a thing. Tip of the hat. Thank you, Isabella Adjani. Another thing that horror movies do is they face and totally acknowledge this mystery of evil. What is evil? Go ahead and try and look that up with the philosophers and theologians, and you will get as many answers to that question as you can possibly imagine. We don't know what evil is. And I would say my general definition of evil is what we call evil. Or in other words, evil is suffering, right? Evil, and especially real evil, is choosing to cause suffering in another by choice. And the most beyond form, the worst form of evil, is to get enjoyment from the suffering of another person. That is the most profound source. Maybe the worst form of evil, actually, is the evil of systemic corruption, oppression, and justice, where people know what they're doing. For example, in America, with mass incarceration, with our prison system, especially with private prisons, where we put prisoners to labor, to work, at where they make, whatever cents an hour, and they really have basically no choice. We still have slave labor in the United States, and people fucking profit. People are profiting off the imprisoned work of other people. What's more fucking horrific than that? Try and tell me. That is evil. So I do think that systemic evil is the worst form because it's cold and calculated. The evil of oppressive business people, I think, is maybe the worst form of evil. But I'm thinking more about personal, individual evil, not so much systemic here. So horror movies allow you to look at evil and wonder about it. It's like the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein said, there's some things that you can say, but most things you can only show. What he means by that is that there are some like objective scientific things that you can say, 1 + 1 = 2. But most things you can't say. For example, when you try and define what God is, when you try and define what consciousness is, nobody knows, by the way. We go on and on. When you try and objectively prove whether or not you love someone or they love you, you can't do it. The only thing you can't say it. You have to show it. You have to do it, right? Horror movies aren't generally about explaining evil. They're about showing evil. Now that you still might say, well, what's the use of that? Like, what good is it to show evil? Well, I'd say if we look at all the ancient traditions, whether the religions or fairy tales and these things, you will see there's always evil. Always. Always. Most of the fairy tales that we've got, that Disney, will make them into a movie and they'll make it seem all cute and nice and like harmless, when if you read the real ones, the original stories, they're like full-on gore fests, and often the ending is totally tragic. We need to look at evil for some reason. We just need to. It's human beings need to do it. And we get some kind of a relief and comfort when we face evil. Here's the key: in a safe space. A story is a safe space to look at evil and to look at the struggle against evil. And movies that are just obviously like this is the Nightmare on Elm Street movies. What is Freddy really? You watch those and you can't really explain it. You get these backstories and stuff. At the end of the day, you can't really understand, like, why does this person want to hurt people? Why does he want to hurt young people? And in a way that he gets some sadistic enjoyment from, especially when they're aware of what's happening. Why? Why? Who can say? I mean, we don't know. Like, that's the whole thing. Why really is Jason in the Friday the 13th movies? Why is he really killing? You could say, oh, it's because he drowned, or, they killed his mom or whatever. And it's like, it doesn't explain the extent to which he kills endlessly. Think about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Why are they doing that? Why do they want to do that? Is it just because they're cannibals? I mean, It doesn't explain the sadistic glee that they get when they're, basically psychologically torturing the girl towards the end of the movie. Like, why? There is no why. That's the whole thing. I recently watched a movie that I've been way too scared to see, Hellraiser. I had attempted to watch it at least 2 or 3 other times, and I was just like, too gory, too scary, I can't handle it. Well, I just was able to go get away to kind of like a out of the way beach house, and I was there by myself for 4 or 5 days before my partner joined me. And I was like, I'm going to watch Hellraiser, and I'm going to watch it alone. And this was like my courageous act, right? And I did. I watched Hellraiser. You know what? It's a good movie. It's full of really interesting ideas. It is scary, and it's gory, right? I don't, that's, you have to be, kind of a mature horror fan, I think, to be cool watching that movie. However, the movie was full of interesting ideas, but it still comes back to a thing like, why would a person be so curious about the pleasures and pain of hell and these Cenobite creatures, demonic things? Why would a person be so curious as to summon them? It's like, I don't really know why, but humans have this curiosity. And again, you're way better off thinking about that or exploring that in a story than you are in real life, right? A movie like Hellraiser gives you a chance to think about that, to feel it, to experience it. And again, you have in Hellraiser a young woman who's totally awesome and strong and tough and she's not sexualized at all, who is like rescuing other people, who's fighting against this kind of suffering and cruelty. My favorite horror movie of the last, I don't even know how long, is Mandy with Nicolas Cage. Oh, it's glorious. I've seen it now, I don't know, 5 or 6 times. It is absolutely fantastic. It's on Shudder if you want to see it, or you can rent it wherever. Mandy is a beautiful movie that I found absolutely cathartic, and that's a movie about loss. And if you've ever experienced real loss in your life, sometimes, not all the time, sometimes you need a way to really confront that grief and experience it again. Hey, and if the main character gets to, beat up a bunch of, or kill like some like demonic figures that cause the suffering, then hey, that's even more catharsis, So I think one of the things that horror movies do is they help us look at and think about evil in a safe way that's not dangerous, and that can even kind of give us more of a confidence in our daily lives in facing suffering. One of the primary things that has led me to this exploration of horror is this idea of the shadow. Now, if you haven't heard about the shadow, it's a concept that Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst thinker, came up with about how all of us have this thing that's a shadow. The shadow is the parts of yourself that you don't like, and therefore you try and repress. You try and keep them from coming out. By the way, so you can do this thing called shadow work, where you face these things intentionally, and it's really cool. It's worth looking up. I did it, and it very much helped me, and it's a key part of my writing now, is engaging explicitly with my shadow. But your shadow is, it's not necessarily your worst qualities, it's the qualities that you don't like. So it's very particular in that way. It's very individual. It's not necessarily the qualities that somebody else would say about you that are bad. It's the ones that you are ashamed of for whatever reason. They might not even be bad things. It could be a good thing. A certain kind of man might be ashamed of his vulnerability or his gentleness, a certain type, whatever. We could talk gender stuff like that. But basically, your shadow, it's the parts of yourself that you're ashamed of and you try and repress. Now, if you do intentional shadow work, then you find a way to express those parts of yourself in a positive and affirming way. And for me, the main way to do that is through story, and through music, of course, too. Music is very helpful for that. That's why one of the reasons why I think metal is so important. When you face your shadow in story, this could be either in watching a movie, reading a book, or writing yourself. write it when you write fiction yourself. Or even, I guess, if you were writing like journaling honestly, maybe, about yourself. You can positively affirm your shadow. Even, like, for example, I think my shadow, one of its qualities is cruelty, right? Well, how in the hell am I going to find a way to affirm cruelty, right? There's no way to affirm being cruel to people. I'm not going to be cruel to people. Well, I can do it when I watch a film, and specifically when I explore a character who's cruel, right? And still look at that character with and see their dignity, even if they're, quote, bad. So facing your shadow, horror movies are great for this. David Lynch's films are full of doppelgangers, sets of 2s and 3s. The newest Twin Peaks: The Return, literally there's 3 Agent Coopers, and they're all different forms of a shadow. And you kind of get the sense as it goes that these are maybe all the same person, and they're not able to come together. They're dualistic, as opposed to embracing non-duality, that we have different natures and bring them together. Find the way to bring those parts together. If you think about a movie like John Carpenter's The Thing, where nobody knows which character is infected and has become like this alien, in a way, it's like a mirroring where you're suspicious of each other, and there's this idea that also, in a way, you're suspicious of yourself, because how could you know if you had become one of these, a thing? Same thing in the Invasion of the Body Snatchers movies, where your loved one, you wake up and the next day they're just different. And how do you know when you are replaced by one of these body snatchers? We all face these questions. These are normal fears and normal questions to have. These movies all take you right into the heart of it. You face it as opposed to ignoring, avoiding, and repressing. And you've heard me talk here a fair amount about like evangelical Christianity. Well, evangelical Christianity in America is directly tied to capitalism. Capitalism also has a way of avoiding your shadow, avoiding suffering, and that is through buying things, or thinking that if you have this or that, then your problems are all going to be solved. When there's a fundamental lack, loss, and limitation and darkness in you, there's an emptiness that's never going to go away. It's the God-shaped hole, in my opinion, in Christianity. God has that hole too. That's just a part of what it means to be alive. We have a kind of emptiness. It's like hunger and thirst, right? You're hungry and then you eat, not so you never get hungry again. What happens? You experience a lack again. That's okay. You're able to eat. You feel satisfied. You get hungry again, right? What's wrong with that? That's fine. That's what it means to be a person, And we go through periods where we feel a lot of joy and fulfillment, and we go through other periods where we feel a deep, profound lack, or maybe a sense that I'm bad, or I'm a failure, or I'm gross, or I'm a loser, or I'm not attractive, I'm not lovable. Like, we all say these things, or just a general dissatisfaction. I think the horror movies allow us to face that dissatisfaction instead of just trying to ignore it. And again, in capitalism, you just fix it by buying something or attaining something. And if you think about the action movies, well, what do? Just kill it. If you just kill it, then that'll solve the problem. This is what you see with the extreme right wing, for example. If you just get rid of homosexuals, if you just get rid of Muslims, if you just get rid of trans people, if you just get rid of the libs, then, everything will be great again. It's like, no. Like, we all have this lack in ourselves. It's okay. Chill out. It's okay. Love your neighbor anyways. Tomorrow might be a better day. We go through ups and downs. We all live in these cycles. I know some people live in a particularly low points, and I have deep, compassion and empathy. And, I hope if you're feeling that way, then you can do what you need to do, whether it's therapy or finding a religious group, or talking with a friend, or hey, maybe watch a horror movie, or maybe get a dog, But for sure, reach out to somebody. That's the main thing. I also want to argue that horror movies are generally politically subversive. I mentioned Invasion of the Body Snatchers earlier. The whole idea of that movie is that, like, society is a pure conformity. And it's challenging that about how to be an individual in the world. Think about Blue Velvet, Lynch's Blue Velvet, set in, made in 1986, directly in the heart of the era of Reagan and the moral majority. And hey, isn't America great? Look at white America. It's totally white movie, small town. Everything's pretty, everything's nice. And underneath, what do you have? Unbelievable demonic misogyny, unbelievable sexual violence against women. It was the reality in so much of America, and we just try to gloss over it, try to not see it. Horror movies say, no, you got to look. And I know a lot of people don't want to look, and I would challenge you. You might not have to watch a horror movie, but don't be one of those people that doesn't look. You got to look. You can't avert your eyes to suffering and injustice. And you can't avert your eyes even to the darkness inside yourself. It's okay. We've all got it. It's okay. Classic subversion in horror movie is David Cronenberg and every movie he ever made, basically, but especially Videodrome, which questions our role with technology, which becomes a part of our body, which maybe takes us over in a sense. I mean, if David Cronenberg was 25 years or 30 years old now, I'm sure he would have made some horror movie about Twitter, This literally like taking over our consciousness, taking over our ability to think. Recently, Jordan Peele has been super explicit with his form of really extremely entertaining horror, like kind of in the tradition of Spielberg, like Jaws, like scary, but really, really fun as well. Except Jordan Peele brings a radical, edgy confrontation with American hypocrisy, whether it's class with us or obviously with anti-black racism, systemic racism in America with Get Out, where we have a direct challenge towards people that say one thing. The dad in the movie, says, hey, I would have voted for Obama if we could have voted for a third term. And yet these people are exploiting black bodies in the most extreme sense that you could ever imagine. The sense of it's hypocrisy, right? Jordan Peele with Get Out, he's not just challenging full-on white supremacist, anti-black racist. He's challenging the nice white liberal who says one thing but isn't willing to do anything to actually be an ally, right, to people of color in this country. Wonderful example of how horror can be a politically subversive and really calling out people to justice in this world. And again, if you look at rom-coms and action movies, you're not going to see it. I mean, I would love to hear an example of a rom-com or an action movie that has been in any way politically subversive. I mean, those movies are about traditional gender norms. They're about law and order. They're about putting people in jail or killing them. They're not about love and real justice. Justice doesn't mean punishment. Justice is love lived out in public. Thank you, Cornel West. So, in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of this time of political change, of activism, Black Lives Matter, defunding the police, new ways of understanding criminal justice, honestly facing our history, the truth, not about what we say, but about what we do. We all need to be doing these things regardless of whether we watch horror movies. What I'm saying is horror movies might help you do it even a little bit more. And even more so, even though I do think that horror movies are political in this way, politically subversive, I think even more when it comes to each individual facing our own pain, our own darkness, our own lack, loss, and limitation, and not running away from it, and not acting out in cruelty because of those things, but learning how to be more empathetic, not just towards others, but even towards yourself. Because the darkness is in me, and the darkness is in you, and that's okay. We can face that, and we can live out in love in the world. So that's my challenge to you, my friends. My challenge is for you to watch horror films so you can face your inner darkness and be more empathetic towards yourself and to others. I want to thank you for listening to The Trace. There's all kinds, I've done almost 60 of these now. Go back and listen to one of the other ones if you'd like. Lucas Gonzalez and I, we did a whole episode on horror a while back. You can check that one out if you want to go deeper on this. But I just love you all, and I appreciate you. And if you want to talk any more with me personally about horror movies, just write me at thetracepodcast gmail.com. And I remind you again, love the neighbor, every neighbor. See you next time.